You're listening to the Find the Others podcast. Today's episode is with my man from down under in Australia, TripWhip. TripWhip is an online creator who makes videos about psychedelics, altered states of consciousness, and his personal experiences. In his psychedelic advocacy, he emphasizes harm reduction and education so we can all be better informed and safe as we seek to legitimize these powerful tools into our society. He has a filmmaker's eye, and that comes through in his videos. I think he is a really articulate, grounded, and reasonable guy, especially considering all of the crazy things he's experienced on psychedelics. I present to you my conversation with TripWhip. Mr. TripWhip, thanks for coming on, man. I'm excited to talk to you.
I'm excited to talk to you. It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, man. We have some mutual friends, of course, and I've come across your videos on TikTok and YouTube, and like the most recent one, the podcast that you did with Vivek and Loka. Really enjoyed that. And I think your stuff is awesome, man. I just wanted to give you your flowers for a second because I've been watching your stuff, especially before talking to you. I'm like, let me do a deep dive, the TripWhip deep dive on your whole channel. And I have to say that you're like a very skilled communicator in the sense that you're articulate, but it's nothing, it's like so clear and understandable, which I think is like such a vital part of communicating, especially when it comes to these topics that elude language sometimes. So
Yes.
yeah, keep it up, man. Keep it up.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that, man. I really appreciate it, especially coming from someone who also makes who does make very high quality videos. I can tell. I'm surprised actually. I'm waiting for you to blow up, man. I'm glad you're in this chat. I'm glad you're got a lot of good people around you now to blow you up because you deserve to be blown up, and we need more people like you representing this. It needs serious minds behind it. I think not someone like me.
No. I would not go there, man. But yeah, thank you so much, man. It really does mean a lot. And, I just do it because I love it. And I was, sitting in cars with friends and getting stoned and talking about this stuff for hours. I'm like, I'm kind of an introverted person in most other situations, but this is the one subject where I just like light up and I can go for hours and not feel drained by it, but actually energized. I just talked to Gabe like this past week and we went for like 3 hours almost. And like any other social situation that would last 3 hours, I'd be like, all right, I'm checking out. But after
Same.
that, I'm like, I'm buzzing, I'm
Yes.
energized.
Yes.
So I'll do this no matter like what the external circumstances are. And, I just want to be what I wish I had when I first got into this. Because what year were you born, man? I have a feeling we're like pretty much the same.
1996.
96? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm 93. So like
Yeah.
when I
Similar.
first started getting into this psychedelic stuff, like my first trip, I was about 18 and it was pretty much in the dark, So I had experiences that I had to like dig really deep for to just to validate to myself that I wasn't crazy, let alone any like sound advice and like safety procedures, best practices, stuff like that, Every psychonaut, especially in this group chat that we have, is like we all have these stories that are just like completely reckless, but a lot of us are kind of in the dark at first. So yeah, that's another big reason. And I see you doing a lot of emphasizing the responsible use
These
and
days,
using tales as like cautionary tales, because they make great stories, but it's like you don't want anyone to be in any unnecessary danger or harm's way. We're dealing with such powerful tools that it can go really great or really bad. So
Yes. Yeah.
it's important to like contribute to that, I think. And that's how I feel when I hear people like you and Vivek that are like saying really smart, serious, but not like in a taking yourself serious way, but like just like, hey, this shit is insanely powerful, so we got to treat it the way that it needs to be treated.
Yes, I think when I started, I probably didn't realize how different everyone was in the way they reacted to these trips, because I kind of thought that if you take these substances and you go to somewhere really deep, like no matter how much you take and no matter how deep you go, you're going to be assisted. You're going to have a great time, because that was my experience. I had some very, very dark trips on some not so nice substances in the very beginning of my kind of exploration of everything, just because I was, spiked by something. And that, even though those were bad trips, they took me to a place so dark that I really didn't believe I was going to be able to come back. So when I did, and then I had these psychedelic trips, they were just, no matter where they got to, they were never those dark trips I'd had in the beginning. And so I had this sense of almost invincibility or something. And I'm glad I did, because without fear, you don't really manifest a lot of dark aspects in your trips. And so I didn't realize, because I'm going, into these trips with zero fear, just pure excitement, my experiences, no matter how wild they got, were always positive. And I thought that was just everyone's experience. But as I've gotten older and, my kind of the youth fearlessness has kind of gone away and I go into a trip, I've not even had a bad experience. And yet I'm still a little bit apprehensive. And I realized, like, holy crap, like, because of this apprehension, those trips were just more difficult and they were nowhere near as intense as the early ones. And so I think with that, I started sharing some more conservative stories, or stories that, kind of were showing how trips can go wrong. And I'd get a lot of comments from people saying, you're doing psychedelics an injustice. We're trying to get this message out to people and we're trying to spread positivity. But for a person who has a bad experience, that shuts off that avenue of exploration for the rest of their life. They can have one bad trip and they're like, I'm done with that. And they have a bad trip because they go into it not realizing how intense and psychedelic it's going to get. And the thing is, if you listen to these challenging stories, you'll often hear they're not actually bad. A lot of the experiences or the effects that make them bad are only that way, or like they only turn bad because of the person's reaction to those effects. So one of the most recent stories I shared on TikTok, the person had a very low dose of mushrooms and he started experiencing something called like the frozen moment effect, which is where all time seems to pause, or all the like people around you seem to just freeze, and you can still hear things, but it's normally just the wind or the rustling of leaves and a couple of birds chirping, and then all the cars have stopped. It's like all of humanity just pauses. And for whatever reason, this is not that uncommon on psychedelics. And so he went through this effect, and obviously started to freak out because this was his first trip ever. And so, yeah, I shared that story. A lot of people in the comments were saying, why do you just share the bad ones? But for me, when I was starting off, that was a good trip. I loved those sort of experiences, that's what really made me passionate about psychedelics. So yeah, I'm just trying to spread the message, trying to kind of, also helps with the algorithm if you're not promoting something that's illegal, but, trying to let people know these experiences are available, but they're probably not something that everyone wants to go through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there's a lot of interesting points that you brought up there. And I think it's a good thing to bring up. Like, there's this interesting relationship of like being at a certain age, early 20s for a lot of us, where you have the most free time you've ever had in your life, and you can spend it exploring consciousness, and you have like way less baggage. Or, I mean, not this is, everyone's different, but in general, you have way less like weighing on you, and the zero expectations of it could possibly even going bad. So I think it's interesting that you brought that up. I will say to the idea of like bad trips, that because you brought up the point of like someone having a bad experience and then it shutting off the avenue of exploration for them for life. Yep. And it probably doesn't help that they hear people saying like, or like ignoring that side of things to invalidate their experience.
That's true as well.
And be like, no, I agree that a lot of bad trips are challenging ones, and it's like the resistance and fear that makes it bad. But I also think that there are exceptions to that too, where maybe some trips really just are shitty and like you get beat up unnecessarily, and that sucks. And unfortunately, like some percentage of people are going to go through that. But there are so many, like if the right information is out there, we can mitigate that harm by preventing people from getting into that mess in the first place. Right. Yes. There's the whole history of the 60s, Tim Leary was the one who discovered set and setting is paramount. And that's like the most solid advice, universal advice that helps everybody, because there's like a middle ground too, where a trip may be challenging and difficult for a moment, but if you have the right setting, support, like a trip sitter, it can totally turn that around. And that was my experience when I was very young. My formative psychedelic experience was 2 hits of LSD. And I knew nothing about it. I had done zero reading. I just wanted to see pretty colors. I wanted to see cool geometry. When that first, like, the come up was starting to ramp up really fast, and, you know, sometimes it can actually feel like you're dying. And when you don't know to expect that, you don't know what ego death is, you don't know, oh yeah, you're gonna like be dissolving, you gotta surrender. None of that was in my head. And so I just thought I was dying. And that happens to a lot of people who don't have that information. But what changed that was that I was with a friend who was my designated trip sitter. And we didn't even call it that either. It was just like, he was there, he was a homie, and he had experience. And when I was on the ground, like going through this, I had to like get on the ground because I was like, what the fuck is going on? And he held my hand like as if I was on my deathbed. And he was like, it was just that act of compassion and presence. And then it turned my trip around to the most beautiful, transformative experience of my life, which like has fueled my passion for this. So I just want to put that all out there too. That's like, yeah, some trips have those challenging moments where the right protocol can send it in a very positive direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the other benefit of sharing your experiences online is you can share what worked and what didn't work. And it is a fine line, because I know that my fearlessness definitely helped my trips in the beginning. But I know that I was also in a very unique situation where, you know, a lot of the things that I did, obviously the most famous one, I'm sure you would have seen, is the running through the streets naked experience I had on acid. And that one, you know, turned out to be fine for me because I live in Australia. Had I been in America, the outcome is very different. You know, I've heard people get arrested for that sort of thing. You know, so it is important to share what works, what doesn't work, and also what to expect. Because I don't know why in the beginning, I think for me as well, the fact that I was a bit of a nihilist, a bit of a pessimist, having my worldviews flipped upside down wasn't such a bad thing. It was like, I had nothing to lose, you know, like worst case scenario where everything I believe in is completely transformed. Awesome. Amazing. That could only be good, because where my headspace was back then was not amazing. And so I was very receptive, you know, to whatever I was being shown and taught. But again, I've, you know, this is why doing this social media stuff has been super eye-opening, because I'll get messaged from people who have the same question, and you know, I'm realizing that there's like a pattern of people who will have these experiences often when they're young, you know, when they're in their, you know, late teens, very early 20s, and they'll have like a set world view. They'll be on their way, they'll be either studying or planning to study at uni, and all of a sudden they take this drug and everything they've ever known is just shown to be not true. And now they don't know if they're, you know, in a simulation, they don't know what. And because of their resistance to that meaning, because they don't want to explore it, which is completely fair, you know, obviously not everyone's got the time to explore these like deep thoughts that come with these drugs that they thought were just going to be a fun time.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, you know, they're in this state of psychosis because they're in between the old worldview beliefs and this new belief system that they're not ready to integrate and don't want to integrate. So yeah. I think it's really good that we share, you know, both the good and the bad sides of these psychedelics, because if you're somebody who hears everything that it has to offer, the good and the bad, and you say to yourself, the good is absolutely worth that bad, and even a lot of that bad isn't really that bad, it's kind of something I'm interested in, or it seems like there's some growth there, then chances are you're custom made, you're tailor made for psychedelics. But, you know, if we have people who are having trips that just it's not for, it's going to kind of taint the reputation of psychedelics in the long run, because they're just going to say, and, you know, a lot of these people I talk to will denounce psychedelics after they've had these bad experiences. They'll say, just, I can't believe, you know, people are still taking these drugs and it's so bad and the government needs to, you know, do this and that. So yeah, it's definitely good that we're spreading this stuff out there. But I would love to know, in your case, how were you so receptive to that experience in the early days? I mean, obviously you were struggling because you thought you were dying, but my first acid trip was also on 2 tabs, but it was a very weak experience because I think I was a very closed-minded person. And I feel like that, I've always believed this, but maybe I'm wrong. I've always believed that that influenced my trip. The fact I was so closed-minded made it more grounded. And the more open-minded I became, the less I needed to take for the trips to get really intense. Were you just really open-minded when you first tripped?
Yeah, I think also I'm extremely sensitive to psychedelics. So 2 hits was very powerful for me. I've always been kind of like a very imaginative person that kind of lived in like a mental world. But it's ironic too, because I was kind of not nihilist, but by the time my first psychedelic experience came around, I had gone through the phase of like raised Christian, then I was like kind of doubting it, agnostic, you could say. Then I was like full atheist, like Richard Dawkins type atheist. And then this experience just like I was not even able to resist it. Like that's how powerful it seemed. It literally just killed my old self in that moment. But I believe that there's probably some proclivities like from earlier in my life that were just like parts of my being, like mysticism, and there's this whole like kind of trail leading me to psychedelics. Like you said, some people are tailor-made. I feel like looking back to before I even took them, I had these little like breadcrumbs that I call them, breadcrumbs to the unconscious. And that was mostly, I think, coming from the mushroom, whatever force, intelligence, entity is behind the mushroom. I felt like it was calling me towards it, and I would have these like visions and stuff. So I feel like, yeah, there's like those 2 sides of the coin where it's like I already had this kind of like mystical inclination, but then I had like kind of created like a shield against that, but the shield was just not capable of withstanding just getting the ego blasted. Or maybe, yeah, ego death, I think, is maybe a term that gets thrown around a little too willy-nilly. I like to think of it ego dissolution, and that can result in a type of death, but it's not like it dies forever. It's just like dissolved temporarily.
Yeah, a lot of people kind of misinterpret that. They think that they always like call you bad things when you say I had this ego death, and then you'll reply to the comments, they'll be like, see, you still have an ego. It is just a temporary experience. But what for you would you define as ego death? Because I've also found everyone has a different definition, and it can be as vague as like losing yourself in a movie to like, getting to the point where no matter what you do, you have no ability to understand even the most primitive concepts like self and other and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's levels to it because, yeah, like you said, getting lost in a movie, that's like entering a flow state can be considered a type of ego death because that part of the mind is quiet. But as far as like how I experienced it that time on LSD, I would say that it was losing the old boundaries of this like little box area being me. Like I experienced cosmic consciousness, and I identified with the larger cosmos as a whole, and I actually felt a visceral sense of scale. Like it wasn't like, we intellectualize things and we understand like we're in space, there's galaxies, but it was like a visceral experience of like, I am that. And then having that new sense of connectivity to all life on Earth, I feel like that is a ego death of the old way of like my boundaries,
Yes.
So that's kind of how I see it. What about you, man?
I think you explaining that to me has helped me kind of grasp that version of ego death, because I've heard it a lot. And when I first started, I actually based it on the first trips I ever had, which were, the when I was spiked with synthetic weed, and they were very, like, honestly, dude, they were absolutely insanely powerful. Well, I should say the first time I was spiked with synthetic weed, and then after that I went ahead and got it myself. But, because as I said, I wasn't in a good headspace. I didn't care. It was just like this was an experience I didn't think was possible. Where my head's at, I'm very arrogant, and I've created this world that's not very nice. So something that's outside of the world I've created, I'll take that. This thing that's opening up the world I believe in, and is a little bit different to what I expected was possible. I'll experiment with that, even though 4 of those trips I had were by far the most challenging, darkest, most intense trips I've ever had in my life. Any experience. I don't like explaining it because words just can't You know, it's hard to explain things, but those trips, words just can't touch it. And what was I saying?
You're talking about ego-death?
Ego-Death, yes. So the very first trip I ever had on it, though, it wasn't bad, but it was a complete loss of self in that I wasn't able to hold on to any concepts at all. So even just depth perception at first, it was like each aspect of my sober experience was losing meaning and losing familiarity. So the first thing I remember is the depth perception kind of losing its meaning, or it's like the normal sense I have of it when I'm sober. And so I'm outside of my doorway and I'm like staring at the door, and I remember it just felt the exact same as if I were staring into space, like at a distant star. It felt like that distance was between me and the doorway, you know. And then I'm starting to look down at my leg and it's losing all meaning. Like, what am I even looking at? I don't know what that is anymore. And then all of a sudden the thoughts that I'm having, I don't know what they are, and they start to just dissolve. I go into a place between the thoughts, and eventually gets to a level where it's, I just don't know what anything is. And so I'd have like a thought, but I couldn't understand, like there's no language. It's just this mental activity and my brain's just crashing. That was what I originally thought was an ego death. As I've come to understand it now, I would say it's when you lose that identity you hold on to when you're sober, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it seems what's interesting about the psychedelic trips is the identity that they give. Like when you lose your ego, they seem to replace it with something else. It seems like you don't just have this profound loss of sense of self. It's like you have this loss of who you were in trade or in exchange for something else, identity, or a like feeling of being connected to everything in the universe, a sense of unity. Like that's what you replace your old identity with. And it feels so much realer. There's this much deeper clarity that comes with it. And that's why it's so hard to explain to people why we can't just disregard these trips, because there is this feeling of it being realer than real. There is this feeling of, you know, you wake up from a dream into sober reality. You feel like you've stepped into a realer world. Well, when you take this trip and you identify with everything, you feel like you've stepped into a realer world where you can see the patterns of everything that's happened before you with more understanding. You don't feel like you're just stumbling through life anymore. You can understand what you're doing, what your place is, the meaning of things, you know. And because it's so difficult to explain, it's often thought of as a chemical feeling in the brain, this temporary subjective sense of enhanced meaning. And it could be dependent on the chemicals in the brain, but in that case, so would your sober reality's experience be as well, you know. And if you can manage to bring back whatever you learned in those trips, I can guarantee you it's going to change and enhance your life for the better. You just have to be able to, integrate it.
Yeah, no. And it makes sense that people would be able to write it off without having had that experience. Because even as a fellow psychonaut, sometimes you hear people explaining what happened in their trip and you're like, I don't really know because I wasn't there. I wasn't feeling what you're feeling. There's so much like intuitive power and processing that like goes into it. And in these wordless states, like what you're also describing, where how do you even translate a wordless state? It's like pure sensory immersion. And this idea that we are like gleaming some kind of something that's realer than real is part of why it's so exciting, you know? And I think you have a healthy balance of like, maybe it is, maybe it's possibly not, you know, like having some sort of materialist grounding to be like, it's possible that it is just like brain chemistry, but I don't know, man. I see a lot of things that it's always fun to like see a new science article that comes out and kind of like confirms this thing that you've been feeling, you know, like I'm seeing things about the brain may be quantum, you know, we may have these tubules in our neurons or our cells that allow our brain to do quantum things, which would explain like premonitions and all these spooky like airy-fairy stuff. This new agey stuff may actually have like a physical grounding to it, and same for like the ideas of like panpsychism, like, which would make it really interesting. Like, you know, how powerful would it be if we can intuit truths about the universe through states of consciousness. People like you who are interested in expanding consciousness are most likely curious about other modes of altering consciousness, especially if it results in a meditative tranquility. I've been experimenting with these gummies for my friends in Minnesota Nice Botanicals, a company made by people like us dedicated to using nature's magic alkaloids to make life a little bit better. They're well known for their Amanita muscaria, the iconic Mario mushroom whose image is synonymous with mushrooms. When I tried a microdose, I felt more zen. I'm already kind of a relaxed and mellow guy, and this kind of locked me even deeper into that state where it felt like there was no chance of me getting stressed out by anything. They also have powerful plants like Kanna, known for its calming mood lift, and my personal favorite, Blue Lotus, which was used as a sacrament in ancient Egypt. I always say that Blue Lotus puts me in a state where poetry will pour out of me, which makes it great for creativity in my music and other creative pursuits. It's a subtle, calming, and heart-opening effect that pairs well with so many other things. And what these all have in common is that feeling of subtle euphoria, lightness of being, and generally feeling more chilled out, without necessarily needing to visit hyperspace. You could use these as a way to unwind at the end of the day, relax you into a more creative headspace, or enhance your meditation, making it a good alternative to the devil's lettuce. They have way more than that on their website too, and I'm looking forward to trying some. I want you to know that I take very seriously vetting anything I would recommend to you guys. Minnesota Nice is run by good people. They're fellow psychonauts who get it and are on a purpose-driven mission to share nature's wonders with the world. There are a lot of sketchy products out there, and it can be hard to know where to look if you're interested in trying any of these things. I have complete trust in their integrity and that they're running this operation ethically and safely. I'm sharing this with you because I've been using the gummies myself for months. I like them, and I genuinely think that those of you who watch my channel would like them too. So if you're interested in adding these plant allies to your toolkit, go to the link in the description and use code SAUCE to get a 10% discount. When you do, you'll help support this channel, support my friends, and help yourself. 3 birds, 1 stoner. You know, like we find out, oh, I think that the entire universe is consciousness. Everything has a higher or lesser degree of consciousness. And then science comes out and says, yeah, we think rocks might be conscious, you know? So
Yes.
It's just such a fascinating thing.
Yeah, it is. And I think it can, it's important to go into these trips with a bit of skepticism. I think so anyway for myself, just because it's going to help you kind of mingle with your fellow man a little bit easier. But It's also like a lot of what I've gone through in the trips has shaped the way I look at reality. And I think that I don't often talk about my beliefs just because they are kind of, so molded by psychedelic trips. But I do feel almost they can at least help you, they can at least show you what isn't real. I can't say, with confidence what I believe that is real, but I can say that, once upon a time, I really trusted my sensory experience and I really interacted with people as like completely separate from myself. And there may be an outside world, I have no idea, but I know now at least that the bridge between the outside world and me is my sensory experience. And across that bridge, or that bridge is very much capable of influencing your interpretation of the outside world, and it's to a degree that we can't comprehend. It's beyond our understanding. And so I think with that, because of how much it can change what you believe, you kind of have to go in with such a determined will to come out with a more positive mind, because you can see things that will also maybe make you more pessimistic sometimes. And so I think it's actually, if you are somebody who's considering doing some psychedelic exploration, I will say it's definitely more likely you'll come out with a more positive headspace for sure, especially if you're not in a good headspace to begin with. And I think if you integrate the lessons you learn, you're definitely more likely to have a enhanced life, a better life. But there are things that you can see which are sometimes reflections of yourself and projections of yourself But because they are so, well, they're as real as your sensory experience of sober reality, you will, if you don't allow yourself to be skeptical, allow yourself to be open-minded and say, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did, you will treat these things that feel real as real. And all of a sudden, this demon telling you that you're this, harvesting produce for these outer beings, and that's the meaning of your life. You're like, holy fuck, like this is it, guys. We're, that's the meaning of life. We're just livestock or something like that. So, it's important definitely to do some spiritual research, and you'll find that there's a lot of stuff that you'll see that at least will show you what in your sober reality isn't real, but there's a lot of stuff that you need to kind of only pick and choose what will enhance your life and just disregard the rest.
Yeah, man. I feel like these things that you and I both just talked about can exist side by side. They can be two sides of the same coin, of like opening your mind to the possibility that we're really seeing something, but then also, as Rob Adeptus Psychonaut says, like, not so open-minded that like shit falls out, or like the bullshit can get in. That's what it was.
Right.
Yeah, not so open-minded that the bullshit can get in. Yeah, because I think especially too, whenever you replace your entire reality, some other stuff can kind of come and fill the void, and you're maybe a little more susceptible to something like that. There's a lot of like conspiratorial thinking in spiritual communities.
Yes,
and
I noticed that.
And not really a lot of skepticism.
Yes.
I one of my influences is this author named Eric Davis, and he always compares it to a tightrope walk, because it really is the most delicate balance to like keep your mind open enough to these things being real while maintaining a solid sense of, like not just letting everything pass.
Yes.
It's not an easy balance, but it is worth trying. And I think a lot of us tend to lean one way or the other, like they had this panel thing with this psychedelic group chat thing. It was also hosted by Rob, and the theme of the panel was like materialists versus spiritualists. So it's like the two camps, right? Where one's saying like, oh, well, and they had funny like self-awareness about it. They're like, oh, well, I'm no fun, and I think this is just all happening in your brain. And then, Vivek's talking about aliens or whatever on the other hand.
Yes. Where do you fall on the argument then? I'm just going to grab some water while you reply, but I can still hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I would say I'm like 60% in the spiritual camp and 40% in the materialist. So I would say I like want to believe a lot of this stuff, but I've also like put it up against some skepticism. And, I was getting into Carl Sagan at the same time I was getting into Terence McKenna. And Sagan has a book called like Demon Haunted World, which is about like using the scientific method as a kind of candle in the dark against like medieval thinking. Because, we can slip into some very squirrely beliefs easily. So I've always had both sides of that. But I will say I lean more towards like the spiritual. Like I consider the universe to be, I would say I'm a subscriber of panpsychism, where I believe the universe is a conscious whole, and that we, dissolve into that when we take psychedelics, and we can perceive like that greater whole and things like that. I'm also like totally want the whole psilocybin thing to be alien entities. I'll admit that I have bias, but like after reflecting on it and, being like, maybe it's bullshit, I still, lean more towards that side.
I think it's hard. It's a hard one to answer, because it's hard to know where the beliefs necessarily like differ. Because it's like with yours, panpsychism, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that's like anti-materialism. It's kind of just like a different interpretation or a different meaning behind the physical world. It's like there's still still a belief in like a physical world with all the same physics, and like nothing has to be different necessarily, but it's just this idea that there's some level of consciousness in everything. It's not necessarily sentient, but it's a primitive form of consciousness that then gets more advanced in certain areas. And then I'm not super familiar, but I think this is it. And then like with humans, they've got a more complex or more dense version of consciousness or something. Is that panpsychism?
Yeah, exactly. Where you just like the very most like basic form of any kind of like awareness of your environment is like a lower primitive form of consciousness. And yeah, we're just like somewhere else along that spectrum.
Right. Yeah.
Which
so, I mean,
I actually, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, like, I wouldn't say that is necessarily, too spiritual or anything like that. But then even with aliens and stuff, like, it's hard to, like, if you thought, okay, the entities you meet in your trips are actually aliens, and then someone else is saying, no, they're just chemicals in your brain making you experience that. It's like, well, that could be just the exact same thing. It's like when we're sober, like we're all talking about UFOs now, right? It's all at the same time that everyone's having these psychedelic trips. What if whatever we're experiencing is just, manifesting itself into a narrative that we can comprehend? And if you're not taking drugs, that manifests itself as aliens from another planet. If you are taking drugs, that manifests itself as aliens communicating with you on some sort of vibrational frequency or, something like that. Because I've noticed even the psychedelic trips and the alien abduction stories, it's freaky how similar they are, man. Like, even like the messages that people are receiving, it's blowing my mind. I was going on a rabbit hole after all these like UFO hearings and stuff. I just thought for some fun, I'll just read some old alien abduction stories. And it was like I was reading DMT trip reports. Yes. They were talking about these beings coming in through a beam of warm light. Then they'd take them onto their craft that defies physics. The aliens would telepathically communicate with the people. Some of them were going into something like a waiting room where they were being watched and observed before being like, some aliens would then like telepathically manifest like different dimensions that they could then have this metaphorical experience through. So the aliens could, communicate to them in these metaphorical realms, and they would see like crystal structures go into like realms of white light without time. Like, it was just, you know what I mean? It's, for me, I feel like whatever is happening is just finding these different avenues to translate itself to us. Are we getting abducted by aliens? Are we, communing with aliens on drugs, or are we just having our chemicals altered? I don't think any one of these can be the complete truth. I think these are all just little, pieces of the puzzle for a picture that we are so far from being able to complete.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And that, connects to what you were saying about how like panpsychism might not be this totally non-materialist viewpoint. And it's this idea that we just like, maybe everything has a material explanation, but it's magical in the sense that we don't understand it yet. There's just so much that we don't know yet, that it could just be like, yeah, this is a real thing, but our puny brains cannot comprehend.
Well, even then, I think we're also kind of conditioned to reduce things to its physical explanation, but we don't have any evidence yet that can kind of give us, we don't have much evidence showing if the physical meaning is actually created by our belief or vice versa. It's like you could be in a very malleable, flexible reality, and then as soon as you kind of create a story for yourself, once you've kind of entered a reality you believe, the physical or the physics of that belief system kind of manifest themselves. So it's like, for instance, if an author was to write a story about a brilliant scientist, that brilliant scientist could understand the physics of his reality and be like, guys, listen, like you've got all these crazy beliefs, but the reason we're all having these experiences are X, Y, and Z. I've got all the evidence for it right here. Little does he know, none of that means anything. He's actually just the product of, an author just having this imagining a reality together. So that's what I mean. At the very least, the good thing about psychedelic trips is they'll show you or make you feel feelings. They'll show you trips and put you through things that involve the aspects of yourself that you use to define reality with. They'll use those aspects of yourself to show you things that feel realer than anything has ever felt before, and you'll then have a completely new picture that you can either choose to take completely literally, or if you don't take it literally, you'll have to sit back and say, if that's not real, I don't know what is. And I'm not saying what I've gone through is real. I don't know. But I definitely, if that's not real, I cannot say I really believe anything else I've experienced or any of my other knowledge is real at all.
Yeah. No, that's trippy, man. It's really trippy.
I know.
I wanted to get into some TripWhip lore.
Let's do it.
Just to get to know you a little bit. So I want to start with the obvious question of where does the name TripWhip come from?
That's so funny. I was just thinking about this yesterday. I don't know. I think I just like the sound of it. It was going to be, I think at one point I was thinking Microman or TripWhip. And TripWhip's the first word that ever came to my head. I'm not entirely sure why, but I remember I was listening to the Psytrance song that had the opening like involved a whip. And I was like, oh, you know, it'd be cool if I like made a YouTube channel and that was like my opening. And then like a year later, TripWhip was born. That was my opening sound. And
yes.
Yeah, it's been like that ever since.
Okay, I've heard the whip crack in some of your older videos.
Yeah.
And you've been at this for a while, man. You know,
Yeah,
like some of your first videos were like 5-6 years ago. And they're great stories. And like, you know, some of the more viewed ones are like about the machine elves. And these are exciting topics of exploration. But I did want to ask you some more origin story lore about like, you mentioned the synthetic weed stories as like some of your first experiences, but would you say those were your formative psychedelic experiences, or was there one that like was an actual psychedelic that went really well that like got you into this stuff?
Yes. So, geez, you know what? It's amazing, man. I'd say the synthetic weed trips are the trips that started my journey onto exploring substances, not just psychedelics, but just substances, period. Because as I was saying to you before, I had quite a pessimistic, nihilistic point of view. Having an experience that was outside of what I thought was possible, you know, the potential to open up my mind, I was just launching full headfirst into it. And I enjoyed the intensity. I think I was living a very boring life, and I think I enjoyed the intense emotion that was available, you know, so easily. But then it wasn't actually until I'd taken LSD for quite a while. My first LSD trip, I remember, was definitely beyond what I expected. It showed me beauty for the first time. And I remember seeing beauty in my environment and thinking, this is magical. But the truth is, it didn't really change my perspective on life that much. I still had quite a, you know, fixed belief system. And it wasn't until I actually mixed synthetic weed and LSD which I haven't told anyone before, but it wasn't until I did that my perspective, like everything shifted. And I had this really hate-fueled relationship with my brother at the time. He'd come out of prison when I was in high school, and he was living with me and my dad. And it was just not a nice relationship, you know? And I had so much anger in so many places that I projected in so many ways. And then all of a sudden, it was taking this toxic substance and mixing it with this beautiful substance. It was weird. It just showed me all of these ancient symbols and fractals. And just by seeing these things, which I'd never seen before, it was almost like I was, you know, receiving a message from them that was like speaking to my soul. And it just did some strange work that I couldn't quite understand. But I remember messaging my friends during the trip and being like, I have to forgive my brother and I have to do this, you know. And then the next day I woke up, my friends were like, what? Why are you talking about forgiving your brother? That's so stupid. And I was thinking the same thing. I was like, yeah, I know. I was just having this really weird trip, obviously. And I brushed it off. But that was the beginning of a series of trips that would continue to do work on me. And after that, I started to learn to kind of trip by myself. Obviously, stopped doing, you know, damaging substances like synthetic weed and stuff. And I remember I'd meditate, and I'd have these blackouts during meditation. And then at the time, I was working at Domino's, and one day I was just driving, and it felt like I got like all these memories flashing back to me, and they were like alien abduction memories. And I was like, what the hell? Like, I have these memories of lying down on a table while these entities made of light are operating on me. And I was like, where is this coming from? And I kind of figured that it's probably my trips, but it just, you know, they were just memories that I couldn't really place. And then I started to really work on my meditation. And I remember at some stage, I started to remember a fraction of my trips. And I started to maintain consciousness, or at least remember the experience I was having while these entities were doing this work on me. And I think if it wasn't for the fact that I was doing like voice recordings, as soon as I was out of the meditation, I would forget all of it because it was so hard to remember this stuff. And every time I'd go there, it felt like so familiar. But it always felt like they were doing some like spiritual, energetic work on me. Again, I'm not saying what's real and what's not real. I'm just saying how it felt, you know. And yeah, I think that was, after that, I would say things like, you know, I want to get healthy. I want to get like a healthy body. I want to have a healthy self-image. I want to do this and do that. And I just started taking action on these things. I never had any belief in myself. And all of a sudden I was going to the gym every day and I was working on the things I was passionate about. I can't say there was ever a definitive moment where, you know, there was this like 180 on my personality. But yes, I would say that it was definitely LSD and my exploration of LSD that put me on the path of betterment. And ever since, my mindset has just improved tenfold. I'm so grateful and happy for those experiences. When I think back where I was and where I am now, it's just, I feel so much love and gratitude for being able to explore this stuff. I don't know where I would have ended up otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely, man. That's so beautiful. So yeah, it sounds like it was more of like a cumulative thing with a little help from some DMT alien surgery.
Yeah.
It never hurts, right?
Exactly.
That's fucking cool, man. I mean, yeah, and the physical health things too is like, that can honestly help with your psychedelic exploration too, you know. Like, I feel like you tend to be more anxious if you know, I don't know, you've probably gone times where you stop exercising maybe for like a little while and then you get anxious way more easily. There's something about like the blood flow to the brain and things are just clicking. I've kind of gone on and off with this, but I've been taking care of myself a lot more. I play basketball like every other day to work out and jump rope and stuff like that. And I can tell like this is going to help with my overall mental well-being. And like, you know, I think that when a bad trip occurs, it takes that initial spark of anxiety to kind of like send you down the spiral. And I think if you're more fortified against that, then you have a higher chance of succeeding.
Right. Yes.
Maybe framing it as success isn't the best way that I'm trying to articulate this, but
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So what about being in Australia? Because, you know, I don't know too many people from down under. You know, I've heard jokingly that it's like America in an alternate universe. I don't know how true. I mean, you worked at Domino's. It's like, that's a very relatable experience, right? And you live in Western Australia, which is like famously very isolated. But, you know, like Tame Impala, one of my favorite bands, they came from Perth, or Perth, as you guys would say it. And it's super like, I don't know. I was like, man, what's in the water over there? Or is it just like the isolation in the nature? So I would just like to hear about like what your environment is like and what it's like to, you know, be a psychonaut over there.
So wait, what do you mean? What is it about Australia? What do you get the sense from Australians?
Well, just, you know, that maybe that isolation lends itself to introspection, and that, you know, Australia is just this wild place full of like interesting nature and all these crazy animals, and like, and just in general, like your own experience growing up, like regardless of my perception of like the music that's coming out of there or whatever, I'm just curious about like, yeah, what it's like for you.
We do have a very psychedelic culture here for sure. And it's funny though, I think it's so spread out that, you know, you may never actually meet anybody else who's even had a trip before. It is kind of like a mini version of America, but it's a mini version of America that's very spread out. And there's a lot of empty space in between. You know, I think, at least for myself, the isolation did influence my trips. You know, I did solo trip mostly, and I've probably come to a point where it's very hard for me to trip with other people. I have to trust someone a lot to be able to trip with them, because, you know, when you do trip by yourself a lot, you end up doing some weird stuff and getting used to, or getting comfortable with being very weird by yourself. And it's hard to stop that with someone else. You know, you do lose your sense of ego, and with that, you lose a lot of your self-control.
It's very vulnerable.
Exactly. Very vulnerable. But other than that, yeah, I would say we tend to be quite laid back, which is probably very helpful as well, because I would trip in public quite a lot, and whilst I'd have some fear of repercussions, it was never repercussions of me going to prison or something like that. You know, setting's a big part of trips. If your setting is kind of always, no matter what happens, the worst that's going to happen likely is you're going to end up in hospital, not anything else, then it is a little bit of a, you know, stress relief. So yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. When I did get police involved that one time, they were very kind to me, and I'm very grateful for that as well.
Yeah, when I was listening to that video, like I think it was yesterday, and when I heard that your friend called the cops, I was like, oh shit, you know, because I have my own perception of what that would look like, and that's like the last thing that you want, is to interact with some dude with a gun who's like pissed off at you or like afraid of you. Like, not good vibes in the back of a police car, let's just say that.
Yes.
And they did take you to the hospital, right? Like they just kind of helped facilitate that.
Yeah,
that's a crazy story.
Apparently they were telling my friend the whole time, like, nah, he's fine, don't worry about it, you know. I'm just like, you know, butt naked, just screaming all sorts of crazy stuff to them. So we obviously, a lot of people are probably doing it here that we just don't hear about. But yeah, no, I would love to. I haven't been to America since I was quite young, though. The only times I went, I was young, and so I didn't really appreciate it for what it was. But now that I know everyone there, you know, or like quite a few like psychedelic creators there, it'd be wicked to come on over, meet you guys.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And likewise, I would love to travel more, and you know, I want to go to the UK. I'd love to see Australia as well.
Yeah, well, you're welcome here.
Man.
When you come, I'll show you around.
Thanks, man. Yeah. It would be cool. So I just want to ask you a few more things. Let me know if you got to go at any time.
I don't. No. All good, bro. I'm enjoying this.
Okay. Cool. So one of the things, you know, when I first reach out to you, for those listening, that we talked about is this idea of like cinema, film, you know, and this appreciation for the eye for film. And, you know, you asked me if I had a background in film because of my setup and the way that the videos looked, but I told you how like it was my brother who really hooked me up with everything. But I know that you yourself are super into that, and I saw some of the things that you made. Like there was a really recent thing you made on TikTok that was like the LSD simulation. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I made it almost a year ago now. I can't remember.
Okay, maybe it's like a pinned post or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was at the top of your feed, and I thought that was awesome, dude. Like, and that's like a very, super creative and like just striking, and like, you know, it evokes like an emotion, and that's like something that you can't just get from like telling the story. You know, maybe a really, really good storyteller, but there's something about presenting it in that form that I feel like was just super effective. So I'd love to hear like your philosophy on film, your love for film, where that comes from, and like how you want to mesh that with the psychedelic stuff.
Oh, thanks, man. Well, I think, as you're saying, there's a lot you can't really tell just by, you know, sharing a story. And I think the cool thing, like there's a lot of simulations out there where the visuals are super accurate. And that's something that since that video, I think that video was the first time I worked with visuals. Looking back now, I'm like, God, those visuals are terrible. But I think the thing about the whole video is the relationship between the visuals and the inner voice, the thoughts, what's going on inside your mind, and how that's affecting what's happening outside and around you. That to me, I think is what I'd like to share a little bit more, because it's very hard to just show the relationship between the internal experience and the external experience. Like, it's very hard to actually separate those two things. Yeah, you know, I think it's also just cool because there's certain like emotions and things that you feel which are very hard to explain, but you can kind of try to share, you can kind of carry the intensity of an experience with, you know, cinema a little bit. That's something I think cinema's always been, or at least since high school, has been a passion of mine, not necessarily creating, but watching, you know, good movies and stuff. And I think there's just emotions that not everyone can, or just actually no one can really articulate in language, that you can express or articulate in a sense through film. You can watch a movie and just be left speechless, feeling a certain emotion and not know why. And in that way, it's similar to psychedelics, like psychedelics can do work on your subconscious and they can leave people feeling a certain way, and those people don't know why. And so I think that's why I've always been drawn to these things, drawn to these experiences or avenues of human experience that are a little bit beyond language. There's just so much mystery there, So I love to combine my two favorite mysteries, film and the expression of human emotion, and psychedelics, which is just like everything, like reality and everything you've ever known being flipped up on its head.
That's beautiful, man. Yeah, and I'd love to see you continue to like push in that direction, because I think what you've done so far is really cool.
Thank you.
And that's exactly how I feel about music, being a musician. I feel like the intersection of those two things, music and psychedelics, is like, what could be more interesting to me, like that. To me, that feels like what it's all about. And I get the same sense that you feel that way about the film and portraying it. And yeah, like I think getting into like a little bit of the nuts and bolts of it, I think with film, you have, acting, you have facial expressions, there's sound design, there's music, there's the composition and the aesthetic, and all of those things tell more of the story. And, music by itself can also do that. It's like, music is putting emotions into a like concrete thing that it's like, oh, yes, this is this like subtle thing that I felt, and here it is being expressed like with such clarity and amplifying it. And I think that film, especially in combination with music, I think they're very symbiotic, art forms that are destined to work together.
Yep.
So, hey man, maybe we can do some shit in the future where like we do a film score or whatever.
Yep. Done and done.
Yeah. Are there any like dream projects or anything, like if there's something secret you don't want to tell, like you don't have to say it, but is there anything like you could envision that you just haven't been able to like create yet?
So at the moment, I've worked on like a few narratives that are probably a bit like technically hard for me to achieve with like my current knowledge of film and like my budget. So I think that those narratives I would love to be able to explore. They're still psychedelic in nature and stuff, They're just kind of, I think, just showing more effects. It's kind of almost like I want to use lots of different films to paint a picture of the other realms and kind of give a little bit more concrete understanding of the experiences that are outside of this sober reality. And that's not necessarily just on psychedelics, that they can be entered through meditation, through astral projection, through dreams, through all sorts of different avenues. And I think there's a few stories where I kind of dive into that, and I'm very excited to just release those. I've got some mini ones which should be coming out soon. I've got a very mini one that I've just finished up, which is kind of like a new version of that simulation on my page, but I've got some longer ones that I'm definitely excited to make. But yeah, I think I want to use them to show people that, I guess I just want to almost, like a lot of tribes, a lot of, spiritual cultures, they see reality in such a different way, where the spiritual side of life is as interwoven into reality as the trees that surround them. It's like a given. They don't question it, and that's because they've had all these stories passed down. And to be honest, actually, I don't know. There's probably actually see a completely different reality to the world that you and I see. They've been conditioned to see something different. And so I would love to use film to kind of paint a reality that has those aspects as a part of it, and it's not, it just feels as real as everything else that we can see with our own eyes. Yeah
100%, man. Go for it. You have my support, and I know everyone else.
Yes. But what about so for you, was your taste in music influenced by psychedelic trips?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because I was telling you before we started recording that like I play progressive rock, which is like this kind of like hyper eclectic style of like technical music, like we're playing like kind of complex stuff basically.
Yes.
And then when the psychedelics and the weed came into the picture, it kind of like made me appreciate things like spaciness. And, there's a lot of musical effects that actually mimic these kind of internal states. For example, there's an effect on audio called the delay, which is basically like an echo where it'd be like, and that's like tracers, you know?
Yes,
So it's
yes.
like got this kind of trippy like quality to it. And there's something about psychedelic music, which is really hard to define, but you know it when you see it or when you hear it.
Hear it, yeah.
And it comes in so many different forms, you know, like guitar-based music in my case, but a lot of like electronic music, you know, stuff like Flying Lotus is very psychedelic. And, you know, like there's whole festivals built around that whole idea where people are like vibing in unison to this, like to these frequencies, and like it's like reinforces that headspace. And when you're not tripping, it reminds you, it like brings you back to that headspace.
Right.
And
yeah, that's true.
So yeah, I got into like, there's a whole history of psychedelic rock music, you know, starting from the mid 60s with stuff like the Beatles, and the psychedelic era of the Beatles is my favorite, you know, band. You know, I like to point specifically to that era. And I just think it's so cool that like at one point the biggest band in the world was making super psychedelic shit. Like I love the idea
yes.
of that like it could be the zeitgeist of like Strawberry Fields Forever is the #1 hit song. Like, and then there's like a lineage that carries on through today, like with the Australian band Tame Impala, who are like kind of carrying that mantle and who were parts of my trips. So like the music became inseparable, you know, like my Kundalini awakening on that same 2 hits of LSD, that life-changing experience that I had, it was catalyzed by a Tame Impala song where I was listening to it and experiencing synesthesia. That's another thing too with psychedelic music, is it's like playing with your synesthesia. So once you're tripping, you're not just listening to it, you're tasting it, you're visualizing it.
Yes.
And it just takes over your entire sense, and then dancing to it. So it's a powerful medium. And yeah, this song, I was getting synesthesia from it, where I was like feeling the clay of the earth. It was like I was getting this sensation of like clay and dirt, and like as if I had my like hands 6 inches in the ground, you know, like I was feeling the earthiness of earth.
Yeah.
And then that actually was like starting at my root, my connection to the earth. And then I, without ever hearing about like Kundalini or anything, I had a full-blown Kundalini awakening, which I tell the story a lot, but I haven't told you about it.
Yeah, tell me about it.
It basically started with this like sensation of feeling the earth, which I would later realize is like connecting to my rooting to the earth. And then it rises up the spine, and then I started to feel like a sensation in the middle of my sternum area, you know, right around the stomach above the belly button. And it felt like this warmth, and it kept building and building. And eventually it felt like there was some kind of fire, not in like a painful way, but it felt like there was this massive warmth like in my stomach area. And this energy became so great that I felt it bubbling up, and then it went into my chest. And when it got there, it felt like that, whatever that raw energy was, got purified and amplified even more. And so now this energy was right here. It was continuing to rise up my spine. I'm starting to feel this like serpentine, like wiggle in my spine. And it's like, and then the energy becomes so immense in my chest that I felt like it had nowhere else to go but out. And then I felt it rise up my throat. And that's when it like I connected into cosmic consciousness and became like as large as the universe. And I felt that whatever that like energy was, this need to express it, it gave me a mission in life. I'm like, okay, now I know what I'm here to do. I'm here to express like whatever this divine euphoric love, like whatever that feeling was at the peak of the LSD trip. And that was catalyzed through music. So it's like, yeah, it's so important to me.
What song were you listening to at the time?
It was called Expectation by Tame Impala.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was off their first album. Yeah, so their whole first album was in heavy rotation at that time.
Right. Did you feel that the words were like relating to your experience during the trip?
Yeah, like in and out, you know. I feel like it was mostly the music, but then there would be that like lyric every once in a while where you're like, oh, whoa, you know, like this is resonating and it feels like I'm supposed to hear this right now. Yeah, that's a common experience with music, right? Where you hear a
Yes.
lyric and you're like, holy shit, are they talking to me? Like, do they know
Yes.
I'm tripping
Yeah.
right now?
Yeah. Did you feel like you had that at least more than when you were sober during that trip?
Yeah, yeah,
And like
absolutely.
subsequent trips as well?
Yeah, and there's been times too where I felt more connected with the lyrics. For example, on another trip, I was listening to the song "Because" by the Beatles, and it's basically, do you know the song?
Yeah, I do.
It's like a beautiful like three-part harmony. It's like no band, just beautiful vocals and harmony. And they're singing like an ode to the earth. It's like, because the world is round, it turns me on. Because the wind is high, it blows my mind. And I was listening to this on acid,
Yeah.
and it was like I was experiencing a full body orgasm, like
Right.
in a non sexual way, but it was just like, whoa, you know, like
Sick.
full blown, you know,
Yes.
and that was in part, you know, more due to the lyrics and the harmonies itself, you know, but
Yes.
like the lyrics were really like contributing to this sense of awe and wonder. And I think that ultimately is another big part of my psychedelic mission, is cultivating this sense of awe and wonder and the universe, which is, you know, an idea I get from some of my inspirations like Carl Sagan and this guy Jason Silva, where they call themselves wonder junkies, where they're like seeking this feeling because it's like it straight up heals your soul, you know, to feel like a sense of wonder about the universe and existence. It's like it has a healing effect, and I think that music is a big catalyst in experiencing that awe and that grandeur.
Right. Yes. That's fascinating. I feel like it'd be such a cool skill to be able to make your own music and then listen to it in a trip. Because for me,
Yeah.
I always like my music taste was definitely massively shaped by psychedelics. So it's like I know in the beginning, the early days, I was listening to a lot of old alternative rock, a lot of old like psychedelic rock, you know, and I just compiled like a massive playlist on it. And the more I tripped, and the more, especially the more I got into like meditation, it was like I was getting called to a different style of music to help with the meditation then. And that's when psytrance came in
Mm.
into my playlists. And I always felt like it'd be really cool to be able to like know music enough to say, all right, this is the vibe of the trip I want. This is the realm I want to go. Because the certain psytrance tracks I'd listen to seem to affect the trip as well. It's like I would listen to Shamanics by Hallucinogen, which is like a very he's the same guy who did Spongle, but
Okay.
it's like a very darker kind of sound to it.
Okay.
And it would take me to like kind of freakier sort of experiences,
Mm.
and I guess like realms, whatever you'd call them. Yeah. Have you like listened to your own music while tripping?
I have once, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and it was kind of interesting. I'll say that I could hear through the production, like it almost sounded like I could hear that it was like, I don't know if fake is the right word, but
Interesting.
it's
Right.
like if you were watching a video or if you were watching a movie and you're like, you can tell that they're acting, you know,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
you
Yes.
can kind of
Yes.
see like, oh, this isn't really like happening right now. I had this kind of funny sense of that, but it wasn't in like a negative way. That was just kind of at the surface level. But there, you know, it did feel really cool to be like, oh, this feels like it's something that's coming from a deeper place in my soul.
Right.
And so that's listening to a recording. I really don't, I've only done that like once. But what I have done more is actively improvising and making music while you're tripping, like jamming.
Cool. Yes.
And that is something else, dude. So the same like Kundalini trip that I had because acid's like 12 hours, right? So there's a lot of
Yeah.
stuff that can happen in
Yeah.
that span.
Yeah.
So like after about halfway through the trip, we went to our rehearsal space where my band practices, and we were jamming, and I had this whole like episode where I was like channeling Jimi Hendrix. And
Sick.
like I had listened to Jimi Hendrix as like a young musician because he's a very like famous innovative guitar, often cited as the best of all time, which like he's like there's a sea change after he came, so it's like even
Right.
if people are better after him,
established.
initiated a lot of that. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
So I was jamming, and I felt like I channeled his spirit through like this jamming, and there was a lot of stuff going through my brain, like the electricity going through the amp. You feel like, you know, like you're like a firebender or something, but you're like wielding electricity.
Yeah.
And it's like this force of nature that humans have like learned to tap into, and now we're just like playing with it and making this like thing wail, and this like, and there was this whole
Sick.
feeling
That's
of
so sick.
and there was this feeling of like destruction, where it was like I was like playing this like gnarly stuff, and that it was like there was beauty in this it was like I was feeling this destructive force that was necessary for new creation. Like, have you ever heard like some Hindu gods have like
Yeah.
these things like that, where it's like they are the destroyers because that's making way for the new? It was like I was tapping into something like that. And one really funny thing that's like not as related to music, but it was happening during this experience. I was looking at my hands. I was like, dude, these are monkey hands. Like, I'm an ape. And there was this unshakable feeling like that. I'm an ape. And I'm like, whoa, like I had believed in evolution like leading up to that point, but there was like this realization, you know, like visceral feeling like, oh, these are like monkey hands right here. And
Yeah.
when I was jamming, I was thinking about how my hands were like evolved to grab onto trees, you know, like that's what these are for.
Yeah.
And I was playing guitar, and like the guitar is made of wood, and I'm swinging around, and I'm like, oh, I'm still like swinging on the tree branches,
That's
like
sick.
just in a different way.
Yeah. Wow, that's dope.
So yeah, man, that's the kind of experience that it's like I'll never forget that, and it like shaped who I am, and like
Yes.
yeah, I'm still on that path.
Yeah, that's cool. It's funny, you know, Jimi Hendrix actually came through in quite a few of my early trips as well,
Mm.
but in a different way. Obviously, as I think as a creator, you'd you know, you can connect to it on a much deeper level. But I know for me, it's funny. He'd always just he had an intense force, and he'd come in like as this. It'd be like this little delayed echo sound. The back of my head would start like it'd be his guitar. Have you ever heard 1983? The Mermaid Owl?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He has a moment in the middle of it where his guitar just starts like coming in out of nowhere, and that sound would always come to me. It always like it's this feeling of something far away, deep in the sea, rising to the surface. And actually, I think it must have been pretty early on in my trips, because it was back when I'd have dark trips as well, and he like saved me from a few of my dark trips. I remember I'd be on the edge of this cliff, and at the end of the cliff was this. I called it, actually I didn't call it, it was something known as the Fear, which people would go to on synthetic weed. That's the place I went to like 4 times, and
Shit.
it was just horrible, you know. And I remember he came in and saved me. It was like on his guitar, just like, you know, Jesus on a cloud or something like that, grabbed me, pulled me out of there. It was sick. But yeah, no, I do love music on psychedelics, man. It has such a deep meaning on it. It means so much more, and it opened me up as well in my sober world. I think I've appreciated music so much more after those trips.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's something about how psychedelics sensitize you that it's like, even like a little sound, it's like it feels like it's tickling you or something, where it's like you might have this kind of shield up in your sober life where it's like the emotions aren't reaching through, but yeah, there's something about that, like the texture of the music and that crossing of the senses.
Yes.
And your enhanced sensitivity to the sound, all of that mixed together just makes it this like immersive experience. And it's like,
yes,
how could you possibly be bored if you're tripping and listening to music on psychedelics? Like, it's impossible. It's just like the ultimate stimulation. And so like, yeah, in a pure hedonistic sense, it's just like a good time. But like, I believe that there's something deeper, like something more important at the core of that. That's like, it's something about our humanity. I think that music is deeply connected to what it means to be a human being.
Yes, I agree. Music's one of those magical things which is just so beyond articulation, or like, you know, analytical articulation, that it's a part of that mystery. Actually, it like shapes that mystery for you. You know what I mean? It's one of the best things that shapes that mystery, because it literally is like its tool is emotion. Like it uses sounds that you're familiar with to weave a story of emotion. It's awesome stuff. And I love that all this stuff, I never would have thought about without psychedelics. That's one of the most beautiful things it does, is it opens you up, makes you more sensitive to as you're saying, to the things that are around you. It just makes you realize what you're interacting with, and it turns you into a child again, but you are a child seeing a new world for the first time. It's really cool.
Yeah, dude, beautiful stuff. And I think that's an inspiring note. I feel like that's a good place for us to cap this off,
Sure.
Return to the child. So thanks for hanging out, man. It was super cool to meet you and
you too, dude.
Talk shop.
Yeah.
We'll definitely be communicating in the future. And man, I hope all is well for you over there, and you don't have to box a kangaroo or something like that.
Yeah, not anytime soon.
Do you have kangaroos where you live?
Not really. So they're here, but we don't really see them. It's very rare that you'll see kangaroos unless you live directly in the bushland, because we've got city areas and then you've got bush areas.
Gotcha.
So I'm in the city area.
Because, dude, I've seen those pictures of the super jacked kangaroos. Dude, fuck that.
Every man here has just this. We're all kind of want to prove ourselves against the kangaroo. That's an Australian thing.
Yeah, it's a rite of passage. It's wrestle a bear. No, I'm taking the kangaroo.
Yeah, exactly.